Welcome to the 56th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I host the New Ventures podcast to help people starting climate initiatives learn from others who are already progressed in their paths. Today, I have a very special guest, Rainer Agster. Rainer is an environmental engineer with an MBA on sustainability management with about 20 years of experience on green finance and green entrepreneurship. I must also add that I've worked with Rainer for about a decade, and we will be discussing on how financial institutions should be using a popular instrument of climate finance called a line of credit. Welcome, Rainer.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Looking forward to this. Thanks for inviting me. It's a huge honor.
Rainer, I'll start with this question. You've worked for 20 years. You look back on the long career. How many lines of credit have you been associated with?
I actually had to start counting, and I looked at it. And so I have been working, I guess, on about a dozen of different credit line products, which means that actually has been more financial intermediaries I've been working with than these dozen credit lines. So I came up with about 30 financial intermediaries I've been working with. Because particularly some of these credit lines, they expand to multiple financial intermediaries. So for one of them, of these financial products, I've been working with 15 financial intermediaries there just for one credit line.
Great. So I think we should just demystify this word lines of credit and financial intermediaries just for our audience.
Yeah, happy to. I think I have to do that quite often, try to explain. Basically, you find development finance institutions which would like to achieve a certain impact, and they have certain amounts of money available. They give these to financial intermediaries. These might be financial institutions, hence banks. It might be funds, and sometimes other institutions which are also able to lend money to online borrowers. And basically the idea is that the money goes to the financial intermediary, and then the financial intermediary does on lending in smaller tranches to actual recipients of loans, and then they produce basically the impact which would like to be achieved. For example, if you look at climate finance, greenhouse gas emission reductions, or adaptation to climate change.
You mentioned climate finance. In the context of climate finance, Rainer, the importance of lines of credit is really helping developed nations move climate finance to emerging nations. Is that a correct assessment?
I would say so. It's definitely a way to transfer significant amounts of funds towards developing countries and emerging economies, and then use the local expertise and skill set in financial institutions to bring these finances in smaller tranches to actual borrowers who will then advance things. At the same time, financial intermediaries get more familiar with the whole topic of financing something they might have been not so familiar with in the past, and expanding their abilities and skills so they can also use own funds, which they generate within the developing country and emerging economy, and also bring it towards climate finance, hence, again, greenhouse gas emission reductions and adaptation to climate change.
Lovely. And just to set the context again for our audience, you've worked with 15 lines of credit, 30 different financial, what you call intermediaries, I call local financial institutions in emerging countries. This must have been all across Africa, Asia. I mean, what are the places that you have worked in?
I've worked in Asia. I've worked in African countries. I've also started working in a few Central American countries. And I also have worked extensively within the EU. And the interesting part here is I find that financial intermediaries, they have the same logic everywhere. So one of the big advantages of these instruments is, of credit lines, it's the same logic. And the differences between these countries when it comes to financial intermediaries is not that massive. And sometimes that's maybe an interesting thing to share with your listeners here. So I have used elements which have been developed in emerging economies and developing countries and actually transferred this knowledge back to Europe, to European intermediaries, because sometimes these topics are more advanced in developing countries and emerging economies.
And when you say topics, and I use the word sectors, just give us a sense. Obviously there have been things like solar rooftops, but you must worked across a whole variety of these topics, right?
Quite a bit on renewable energy usage when it comes to production of electricity, but also to thermal elements here. But it goes beyond that. It goes into quite a bit of energy efficiency in industry, energy efficiency in buildings. And I've also worked extensively on the topic of green entrepreneurship finance, hence companies which already have a green business model and how to finance those. What we're now exploring more and more is the topic of adaptation finance. So there you will find a lot of agricultural elements, for example, irrigation systems connected to that. So this is an expanding sector, but also in the direction of municipal infrastructure finance. So this is the larger scale tickets. Everything else I said before was more smaller scale tickets.
And just to sum up before we really dive into the lessons in the next section of the podcast, I think the important point is lines of credit are a very useful product to move climate finance from developing countries to developed countries. The interesting thing, Rainer, which you mentioned, is the scalability. The product is pretty standard. It can be used across multiple sectors. It can be used across multiple geographies. It is absolutely important to understand that local financial institutions, their ability to deploy lines of credit as climate finance is very similar across challenges, both the strengths and the weaknesses. And that's the context with which we jump into the next section. And there I begin by asking you, Rainer, one key measure of the success of a line of credit, whether this gets deployed in the first place. Now, this may sound surprising to some of my audience because the conventional wisdom is that there is a shortage of climate finance. So they will ask, so why should there be a concessional line of credit not be utilized? Could you just help us understand?
Thanks for this question, Sanjoy. I think this has also been puzzling for me in regards to why are sometimes these credit lines not fully utilized, or why don't they just fly off the shelves? And the answer to it is, and we've developed actually a model around this. We call this the barrel model. So think about a wooden barrel, which has different staves. And the length of these staves, that limits the ability of the barrel to contain water. And the different staves, these are the different, I would say, features which come together, different elements which come together, which determine how well such a credit line can work. And one element, or the success potential of this credit line, one of these is the financial terms. As you just mentioned, having it concessional. The better the financial terms, the more likely it is to go. But there's also other elements which come into it. Of course, most importantly, or one of the most important ones being the market. Is there market potential? Is there actual demand in the market for this? Does this market fit the ability of the financial intermediary to address this market? What about the motivation of the financial intermediary as a whole? What about the motivation of the team which is implementing it? And also, what about the ability and strength of the team in the financial intermediary to do something? And in regards to the process, how difficult and how complex is the process? These are different elements which come together in terms of limiting the ability of such a concessional loan or such a non-concessional loan also to go into the market and achieve an impact. And I'm happy to elaborate on the different elements here. But there is limiting factors there, and I've seen it quite often that A, there's an issue that not the whole credit line can be utilized, and B, there's often an issue, it takes a long time in lead up till the actual loans start flowing into the market. And that's one of the big issues we're trying to address, and we have developed quite a few concepts over the last years and decades actually now to address this.
I'll definitely take you up on the offer of deep diving into some of these issues. I think the most important issue, from my experience of working with financial institutions and lines of credit, is the market, the point that you mentioned about the market. Then, of course, the issue of the ability of the team, because these are all large organizations. So the person who signs the agreement is not the same person who implements the line of credit. And then the third issue is around processes. But perhaps you can talk a little bit about the market, because that's often missed, in my opinion, but perhaps is the most important topic.
I wouldn't rank them as you just did, Sanjoy, in terms of what's the most important one, but I certainly think the market is a very important one. Why is the market important? If there is no demand in the market for the product, it's very difficult, of course, to bring this product into the market. And one important issue is, which we often find, that the development finance institutions, like the likes of World Bank, ADB, KfW, AfD from France, they bring money to the financial intermediaries and then negotiate a certain product. There's a huge interest with the financial intermediaries to accept this product. And they will take a lot of concessions on that. on these negotiations. But then the product which has been negotiated might not be a good fit for the market. And one element to address there, which we are looking into, and we see some movement there also in terms of the development finance institutions, is that the financial intermediaries nationally being active, they need to think more about what can they actually bring into the market, which works in terms of climate finance related topics. And climate finance related topics means, again, impacts, greenhouse gas emission reductions, or adaptation to climate change. So I wouldn't say that often the market is not there, but the product which is being designed as a climate finance credit line doesn't match the market needs because it has been negotiated in other sectors, between different stakeholders, which don't have 100% aligned interests. And then one of these stakeholders, the financial intermediary, has to bring this to get the loans into the market. And that's sometimes a consistent issue. So one of the solutions there, just coming with a solution, obviously, is to much earlier engage the financial intermediary, which is bringing the product into the market, in also designing the product for the local market.
Great. I mean, the way I say the same thing, and maybe it'll be nice to hear your reaction to this is that lines of credit are often negotiated top down. I wanted to do, 50 million in a particular field in a particular country. What ideally should happen is a bottom-up approach. What is it the local financial institution should be asking? What is it that my clients are demanding and I cannot meet? But how can I get climate finance from an international development financial institution to meet that need? So looking at it from a different lens.
Fully agree there, Sanjoy. I think this top-down versus bottom-up approach is one big issue. And maybe to expand on this, I think there's also a certain differences in interests within the financial intermediaries active in the local markets. Within them, there is the department which is in charge, like the treasury, in charge of generating funds, which can then be used for on-lending. And there might be also international DFI relations department. And on the other side, in a different department, there are the credit appraisal departments, and there are the front office staff and the desk officers who have actually talked to the clients. And they are usually not engaged in this whole design. It's mostly the ones who deal with the development finance institutions. So even within the local financial institutions, there is a disconnect between these departments. So there's also a top-down, so to say, versus bottom-up issue, not only on international level, but even within these institutions. So fully agree on that.
Perfect. And that actually helps us deep dive into the second point, which is the point about processes that you brought up.
Yes. And for the processes, I always think around the front and desk officer who have to deal with the clients. These are the ones who have to apply these processes. And usually how I would see it, there is the normal standardized appraisal process within a bank for a loan. And that's not going to change. There's going to be a standardized appraisal process, looking at the credit risk, looking at the client, looking at what is being financed. That's a standard process. Now, with climate finance or other topics of green finance, which might come into it, you have a process which is happening to a certain degree in parallel and a little add-on. But I always assume, let's leave the process which the bank uses, the financial intermediary uses, as much as it is. And let's add on then eligibility checking on the side, and ideally eligibility checking, which goes a little bit beyond that, also looking at impacts. But this checking process has to be operationalized for the front and desk officers who deal with the clients and the people deciding on the appraisal, hence the appraisal committee, which you will have for, I would say, 99% of the financial institutions. So this is a key element here in terms of the process. It has to be very much aligned to what the bank is doing anyway. And it has to be understandable and operational for people who don't have specific knowledge on climate topics and who probably also don't need to have it or maybe are not too interested in doing that. We're not going to make everybody in a bank a climate expert. Some of these institutions have tens of thousands of employees. And most have hundreds or thousands of them dealing with clients. Not everybody's going to become an expert on it. But if they have a process which works and they can understand and they can put in information and the process gives them the result that this is eligible, that's what works.
Great. I'm going to say this in my own words because from my experience, the thing is that it has to be seamlessly added on through the processes already being followed by the bank. And I really like the point that you made about it. The goal need not be that we want to make all those tens of thousands of employees climate finance experts. We need them to know enough to be able to understand the particular eligibility, a little bit more about the impact of a loan.
Exactly. That's what's needed.
One reason I've particularly found some credit lines often failing as in not being able to be utilized completely within a time frame, is that it often takes too much of a time between the negotiation of the line of credit and the actual deployment of the line of credit. Have you experienced that?
I have also experienced that, but I'm sometimes not sure if that's such a huge problem. I think there's a lot of excitement. And then all the involved stakeholders, particularly within the financial intermediaries, start realizing what it means. Because in the end, it means, and that's maybe a bigger topic here, it means that the financial intermediary is providing an additional product. And let me explain what I mean by it. Classically, a bank would be most focused on the financial side of things. So transforming available funds into loan products and then generating revenues from these loan products. That's, I would say, classical banking. That's what they are familiar with. Here we're talking about, to some degree, concessional funding coming in for different reasons. Might have a longer tenure, might be foreign currency, might be that there are also some concessions on the interest rate, which is all fine. But of course, the DFI expects some additional returns for it. And here we come to eligibility, here we come to impact. And I think soon we will see that the DFIs are going to ask for more quantified impact. And this impact, which is being generated, that's an additional product now this financial intermediary needs to produce. And this often takes more time than the financial intermediary and everybody else expects to move ahead. Even financial intermediaries are with receiving credit lines, for example, on SME finance, but there they don't need to generate a lot of information on the additional impact being generated. They just have to say this money has been going to SMEs and then give some estimates on job creation, on economic growth. Now, a different, so to say, currency is being generated, which is greenhouse gas emission reductions in terms of CO2 equivalents, energy efficiency reductions in terms of kilowatt hours, or the number of people becoming more resilient due to these measures which are being financed. And this is changing to a certain degree, I would say, even the business model or expanding the business model of financial intermediaries. And that what makes it complicated. So I've seen that is an issue, that it takes a long time, but I think it's an issue for the right reasons, because actually the financial intermediaries are now producing something, and once they sign it, they sometimes haven't even realized that they all of a sudden producing something else except for financial returns or in addition to financial returns.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. The ability of the financial institution to generate additional information by collecting it from their clients. But let's move on. From the standpoint of the international development financial institutions, the likes of which you mentioned, KfW and AFD and IFC, one question that they ask is the issue of additional. This particular line of credit should support, in their opinion, local financial institutions to lend to areas and companies that they would not otherwise have done. To what extent in your career have you seen that play out?
I think it's overall a gradual process. From my perspective, we are now living in times where basically every financial institution will move step by step towards more green financing, because this is becoming part of the core business. If you look at DFIs, like we also work a lot for the European Investment Bank, they have set themselves a target for being 50% of their lending being climate finance. So this is not a niche product anymore. For them, it's a core product. It's going to transfer into or transform also into local financial institutions. So climate finance, green finance is going to become a core product which they are offering. And so we have seen quite often that banks start with one credit line or one technical assistance receipt, and then they move to the next one and the next one. And all of a sudden, there's also different demands coming in. For example, you have now central banks in many emerging economies and developing countries also asking for information, which is not purely financial, but which is more and more also in regards to climate, in regards to green and beyond. So we see a lot of movement there, and we have also seen quite a few banks now moving into the direction of first gaining experience with a credit line and then moving on. And actually just this week I had talks with a bank and they have just tried it out. They didn't receive any concessional funding or anything. They just said, for us, we think the market is moving towards green finance. So we have just tried out a green financing product, a green financing instrument, which they hadn't done before, just like that. So there is a gradual process, and I think there's more and more steadiness in this process, but it's not going to stop. It's not a one-off effort. You're not going to have some support and then you're going to be a green finance institution. You're going to be okay in 2023. You're going to be a little better in 2024, and you're going to be a little bit better in 2025. And I doubt very much that this project is going to stop before 2050, and we're all going to be net zero, basically. So this is going to be a gradual process, and it's not about perfection right now in 2023. It's about starting, improving, and then improving further. And even institutions which have been involved now for the last 5 or 10 years, they will need to improve as well. They have to be better next year than they do this year. So for me, this is an element where there is a lot of additionality coming in with these credit lines.
Right. You've kind of gone into the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is the topic of mainstreaming. The idea always the line of credit is that without the concessionality, financial institutions would be able to lend to that sector on their own. From what you are describing, you see that slowly happening as well, right?
Very, very much. There is so much dynamic in this, and they look at regulatory elements coming in from the regulator in the countries. They look in the topic of interesting funds coming in from international sources, and they look very much at their peers. So financial institutions always going to look what their peers are doing. And if a couple of them are moving, the others at least want to be trying to catch up. Not everybody wants to be leader. I think 10 years ago, if I look at the topic, there was always 1 or 2 leaders in each country, and the other financial institutions couldn't be bothered so much because the leadership position was already taken. Now there is an understanding that the baseline is increasing, and so everybody tries to stay ahead of the baseline. And so they're looking a lot what the peers are doing, and I see hardly now any financial institution not moving on financial intermediary.
I'll try and sum up a few thoughts which to me important. What I'm hearing you say is that in the emerging countries, the countries where you worked, Africa, Asia, where I have also worked, and of course in Central America where I haven't, and in the European Union where also I haven't, but across these entire countries, you see local financial institutions try and adopt green finance products proactively. Not just 1 or 2 leaders doing it, but almost everybody doing it, and sort of mainstream that in their financial products. I'm hearing you say, and this I think is very important, as advice to the local financial institutions who should listen to this podcast, is that they should be taking a programmatic approach, a strategic approach, thinking about what their customers demand, which is what we talked about earlier on, and then working backwards to think what is the type of liabilities they should raise from the international development financial institutions and the type of process changes that they should make to be able to deploy that efficiently without making significant changes in their existing processes. That's what I'm kind of taking away.
Perfect. I think you're taking away exactly the right thing, Sanjoy. That's what I would highly recommend. And I also assume that probably you would highly recommend it.
Right. It's not easy working 10 years and not thinking at least some things commonly. Let's talk a little bit about in the last part of the podcast is, just go back to this term called technical assistance, right? I think we should explain this for our audience. And they come with lines of credit. They are They're grants provided by the international development financial institutions, and they're often written in fairly complex language. But they come with three key components: capacity building of the local financial institution, the marketing to end customers, and support and reporting, which you alluded to. Just at a high level, what's the best way to deliver these support services?
I think what we see nowadays quite a bit is that there is a mix between tools being applied in this. So we see a huge trend of digital tools being used in this technical assistance, which then reduces also the needs for some of the capacity building being done. Because if you can use more digital tools, they can be integrated into the process. So you might have less people to do capacity building with. That's one trend. And I think another element which is very crucial is that there is more capacity building happening in terms of the banks being able to do the things themselves. So there is more ownership and more empowerment with the financial intermediaries, so they can also move the process themselves. You remember before I said it's a continuous process. So you need to be empowered and need to do it yourself to be able to move on. If you have somebody externally coming in, which was often the case in TA, doing the work, which is then related to environment, green, energy efficiency, then you don't move the own organization. You don't build the capacity internally. So that's one important element here. So I think there's a lot of things changing here. What we see, and that's also a topic of scale, is that it makes a lot of sense. And we recently have seen Proparco and EIB move in that direction, that they set up a whole, I would say, facility, which then provides this technical assistance not only to one financial intermediary and one line of credit, but rather having a wholesome system which can provide this to multiple, even several dozen of financial intermediaries. And that's a very interesting development. It's also something I would very strongly support. Let's get away from this singular assignments on terms of the viewpoint of the development finance institutions and rather have a more wholesome approach in this direction. So that's something I can see certainly as a trend and which I would highly recommend. But having said that, it's experiences, and we also on the side of TA providers, and Sanjay, you provide TA, I provide TA, and there are dozens, if not hundreds of others out there doing the same. We also have to move. I think the solutions which we used to use in 2015, and maybe even the ones we used in 2020, are, from my perspective, not appropriate anymore now in 2023, and certainly won't be appropriate anymore in 2025. There needs to be a lot of movement happening also in the way this technical assistance is being provided to financial institutions. Also accounting for the fact that for the financial intermediaries, it is something which is of huge importance, and it addresses different elements within the financial intermediaries to be changed.
Absolutely. And you particularly, I know you have been at the forefront of developing digital tools that allow what I call the scalability of technical assistance solutions. And I think what you brought up in this answer is also the use of products which can be used repeatedly with multiple financial institutions. But one thing that I worry is that the way technical assistance contracts are awarded, which is always in person months, but I worry that they disincentivize technical assistance providers to develop these products.
It depends on the DFI who is tendering them. I think there are different DFIs have different ways to do it. As I said just before, there are the ones which go more for a singular approach, and there are the ones which go for a more multiple beneficiary approach. Let's put it this way. So we have multiple intermediaries to deal with. And one important aspect, which I didn't say before, how this TA gets better over time is refinement. So you have these tools, might it be digital tools or facilitation tools or whole processes or information, which is provided to financial intermediaries. They get better over time if they are refined. If this is only a singular case, of course, you don't have refinement in there. And that's one important aspect. Another one is the continuity of people doing it. If you assign a staff only to do one TA, it's likely that this is not going to lead to improved TA next time the person is doing it. So it has to be a more wholesome process also to have this expertise being generated and refined. But I guess more importantly, to have the tools, facilitation tools and digital tools to be more refined over time. That's the crucial element. I can also see a lot of movement within the DFIs, and there are now different ways of thinking about it, depending on the respective DFI.
Right. This singular approach that you talked about and what you said is ensuring the continuity of the staff. One problem in which some DFIs, or often DFIs, want TA contracts is they do it to a tender, which of course they have to because it's public money. But it often ends up in a situation where one consulting team is working with a local financial institutions on a line of credit, and then a year later, another consulting team is working with them. In these cases, I think the problem that happens is that the learning never carries over from project to project.
That's certainly an issue. Yes, agreed. I think there's another issue here as well. And this is that often these contracts are awarded. I think they have to be competitive tenders, but they're often awarded on CVs ticking boxes. And I think where things need to move towards is to look more into the quality of services, the methodology of services, the maturity of services provided. So maybe changing to a certain degree the ranking and the importance of different elements of the competitive tendering. So still competitive, of course, but combined with less proneness towards the CV and more towards the methodology. That's one element. The other element is how to carry these things over. I think it's also for DFIs to collect the information, and that's where tools come in. Again, digital tools and facilitation tools to collect this information with them, because they have so many TA projects they tender out that they can collect the actual products being produced there, feed it back into their system and make it more available to others doing the same work. And this may be how you can get out of this box of different teams coming into the same financial intermediary. Maybe one thing I've seen also, often financial intermediaries also get TA support from different financed by different development finance institutions. And then there is a huge lack of transparency from all sides. Who is providing what and doing what? And so more conversing with each other might be incredibly useful.
Right. I think we should spend some time in giving some examples of tools that help these processes, because I know you've worked so much on these topics. So just one or two examples.
Let's start off with the digital tools. In terms of digital tools, I have led the team who has developed the Green Checker for EIB, for the European Investment Bank, which is basically a tool which allows for online eligibility checking on green investments for various sectors. It might be for SMEs, it might be in agriculture and beyond, also for renewable energies. This is at the moment available publicly on the website of EIB, on the Green Gateway website of EIB. And this helps bank staff with very simple information, which every loan applicant would have, to estimate. Firstly, they can decide if it's eligible under the EIB green criteria. And secondly, it allows them what's the potential impact of this measure. And the huge advantage here is that you can basically type in what kind of measure you have, and it gives you some impact estimation and eligibility check. And you don't need any capacity building being done to use that. Everybody can basically use it right away. And secondly, it provides you to do it. Of course, the first question is estimate which comes out of it accurate. It's of course not 100% accurate for the individual measure, because for this, the calculation is too easy. But looking at the credit line, usually there are dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of measures being financed. And that makes life for everybody easier in terms of estimating it. But B, the overall impact, you can be pretty sure that the overall impact is achieved if by all the measures being financed. The Green Checker provides an option for bank staff, but also for clients and customers to assess the eligibility under the European Investment Bank's green criteria, but also to estimate the impacts of the measures being used. And of course, the individual impact is not going to be 100% correct. But the aggregated impact of hundreds and thousands of measures is going to be the minimum which is achieved with these measures being financed. So that's an interesting aspect here. Again, what's also interesting is that there is no capacity building needed, neither for bank staff nor for clients using the green checker, because it's very much self-explanatory. And I invite you to try it out. Another element in tools, which I would like to elaborate, is the topic of, it's very important for the financial intermediaries to define and think more about what the market they have for green finance instruments and for green financial products. So I've been involved in the development of a so-called Green Finance Academy, which is basically a process where financial intermediaries, and we've used that in a couple of dozen by now, emerging economies and developing countries, where financial intermediaries there develop financial instruments which work in their market. So there's different steps which can be taken to assess this, and there is a whole process behind it where the financial intermediary is then able, in a facilitated co-creative process, to develop their own green financial instrument. And this can be, to a certain degree, being standardized in terms of the facilitation methodology. But of course, the outputs which coming out of that are very different and very localized and always fitting to the local financial intermediary. So these are two examples of one being a digital tool, the Green Checker, and the Green Finance Academy being a facilitation tool, which then can be standardized, but still have enough individual ability to move ahead. And we have actually used both of those in various contexts with various specifications for individual financial intermediaries, but also for several financial intermediaries at the same time.
And Rainer, this is really interesting because, the checker tool that you talked about, I'm realizing the definitions of what is green, luckily, are getting standardized, right? So you have the taxonomies coming out. Obviously, every country is going to have its own taxonomy, but the European Union's taxonomy is playing a strong and influential role. Then in the context of the lines of credit, we obviously have the MDB taxonomy. So once these standard definitions of what is green and what is not green become more acceptable across all jurisdictions, a tool like Green Checker, like the one you described, can really scale. So that's obviously one reaction I had. The other reaction I had is about the Green Finance Academy, where you are talking about helping financial institutions assess market potential and then sort of develop products for that market potential. I'm realizing that in the context of adaptation finance, the one that you talked about, we often think adaptation is so localized and it is localized, of course, but even in adaptation, market potential around addressing topics of nature-based adaptation, of food security, are often common across many Asian and African countries. So even there, this particular approach that you described, it can be fairly useful. Obviously, it's very useful in mitigation. In mitigation, these things are already standard, but even in adaptation.
Yes, indeed. So we're also actually working on similar logics to be applied for adaptation finance. Maybe one thing to say about the taxonomies. I think the taxonomies are useful in standardizing, but as you said, every country is now developing their own taxonomy. And I think the common denominator might not be the taxonomy in the end. It might be the quantified impact. And that's what I also would see as one of the big trends here, that financial intermediaries, DFIs, and the TA community, I would call it, the people providing technical assistance to green finance, they provide tools, they provide information, and they think around how to quantify this impact. Because the quantified impact in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, people are becoming more resilient to climate change, but also connected to that, green jobs, green growth, and probably also social justice. If we can combine that and start quantifying that with different indicators, then we have our common way to do it. Like we use it now for US dollars and euros and Indian rupees. And it's a way to have a common indicator which helps to quantify this. And then the taxonomy might only be an intermediate step to become to more impact quantification. And that's what I find exciting, I have to say. And I think that also works well for the topic of adaptation, which you just raised in terms of thinking around what are KPIs related to adaptation, and then comparing also different adaptation measures, but also mitigation measures, looking into how much finance creates how much quantified impact. I think that's going to be the exciting part for the next 10 years of work for us.
And with that, I'll come to the end of the podcast, and I'm going to ask you to do a very difficult task, which is to sum up your top level advice for local financial institutions in these emerging countries and their partner international development financial institutions as they discuss their next line of credit. If you could be in the room in all these meetings, I'm sure you are there in many of these meetings, but if you could be in the room for all these meetings, what would be your top advice?
Develop more passion for impact, quantified impact. I think that's my number one advice. And my number two advice, equally important, I think we have to think about more combination of financial instruments, financial products, with non-financial support. With the TA, there's already non-financial support to the financial intermediaries, but there's also more and more non-financial support needed towards the beneficiaries or the people or the companies taking the loans. So they also need non-financial support. And ideally, this could be combined with I call them financial facilitation mechanisms. So there might be something in there. At the moment, we more often think about concessional loans, but maybe there are other financial facilitation mechanisms like a partial grant, which could also benefit this. So there is more impact at scale. I often say I have heard a lot of interesting and good stories over the last 20 plus years of my career. Now I'm really keen to have more impact at scale. And I think that's something I'm very much looking forward to. And I think this combination of these different elements could be something exciting and something interesting. And I've been involved in one project in Uganda, the Uganda Green Enterprise Finance Accelerator, which does exactly that. And there we try also to expand now into further elements to combine even more these three elements: financial support, non-financial support, not only to financial intermediaries, but especially to the beneficiaries, and these so-called financial facilitation mechanisms, which could be grant mechanism building.
Yes, and I'll take up a few other things from you said and provide my own advice to these conversations. I would actually encourage local financial institutions to be far more strategic, to sort of lead the conversation, if you may. And I think that's what you said also, Rainer, to understand and know what their market needs, and to also co-create the market with other players in their countries, and then go back to the international DFIs and say, okay, given our ambition to create this market and absolutely correct, create this impact, what is the type of support that you can bring to us in order to do so?
Yes, I fully agree here, Sanjoy, as well. I think that's something I've indeed mentioned quite a few times. The financial intermediaries in emerging economies, in developing countries, from my perspective, also have to become more proactive in developing workable financial instruments which work for their market.
I'm going to turn this table around one final time and say, Rainer, do you have any questions for me?
Not so much at this point. I think what would interest me, since we've talked now a lot about it, is there something from what I said which you disagree with?
I think one thing that I feel that you perhaps don't see the risk so much is the time lag that happens between signing the line of credit and between agreeing on the line of credit and doing the assessment of the line of credit and the actual implementation. I've seen dozens of examples where the market is completely moved. So I'll give you an example without mentioning specifics. You do a line of credit and where you want to say that a particular industry needs environmental upgradation. And this particular industry is a very export-oriented industry in a developing country. And you do the assessment, let's say year 2006 or 2008, and then the actual line of credit comes in 2011. But by the line of credit comes in 2011, the market players are not sitting around doing nothing and waiting for the line of credit. They have borrowed on their own. They have invested in those environmental upgradations using their own money, taking some unsecured loans from their customers perhaps also. And so by the time the line of credit comes in the environmental upgradation, the demand has disappeared. It was there when the assessment was done. By the time the product or the money is actually on the table, the market has disappeared. I think you probably don't see it that way, but from my perspective of having worked in these markets, I think financial institutions on both sides of the table have to move far more faster.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sanjoy. I guess I have become more patient over the years and more accepting that this is the way it just is.
Lovely. Well, I think we will all egg ourselves on in this last decade of action before we all retire, Rainer.
Yeah, I guess so. I think there's going to be so much more to come, and there's so much dynamic into the market that, I'm looking forward to what's already happening and what's coming.
With that, thank you very much, Rainer. But before I let you go, I would ask you, if our audience wants to get in touch with you, how should they?
They can get in touch with me. Just Google my name, Rainer Agster. That always works because there's not that many with this name. I've recently set up an entity called Amplifin here in Germany, where we do and will do support to financial intermediaries. Happy to be in touch with anybody who's interested. And Sanjoy, thank you very much again for inviting me to this podcast.
Would you want to give the website of Amplifin?
Yeah, that's amplifin.eu, and that's spelled AIMPLIFIN.eu, Amplified Impact.
Brilliant. And with that, thank you very much, Rainer.
Thank you, Sanjoy.